All right, some of you may know I mentioned The Deepest Breath is a documentary that came out on Netflix recently about the sport of free diving. Essentially, scuba without the tanks. Free divers need to hold their breath for as long as possible as they go as deep as they can. I'm excited today to speak with free diver William Trubridge. He joins me from Okinawa.
Morning, Mosh. How are you?
It's morning in Japan. It's evening here in Brooklyn, where we're talking. Will, I want to get into the documentary and the sport writ large, but let's start here with free diving. I tried my best there to explain, scuba without the tanks. You're holding your breath. When people ask you what is free diving, how do you explain it to them?
It's basically breath hold diving, so holding your breath and going as deep or as far underwater as you can. But it's completely different to scuba diving. Scuba is you're basically like a tourist underwater, whereas in freediving you are kind of assimilated part of that underwater world, an underwater creature yourself.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, and I'm curious what led you to that. Take me back. Where did you first discover it? And what led you to say, I want to make a career out of figuring out how long I can hold my breath underwater and how far I can go?
Yeah, in my case, I feel like I've always done it right because I was brought up on a boat, and as early as I can remember, we were snorkeling, playing in the water, trying to find shells on the reef underwater. So it's for me, it's just kind of a natural thing to do, and it's now become like a professional part of my life as well. But I feel like I've always been someone who's drawn to be underwater.
Yeah, so when you say you grew up on a boat,
Yeah, we
that was your home? Like you guys were full time living on the water?
that was our only home. Yeah, my family, my parents sold the house we had in the north of England to buy the boat. This is in the 80s, early 80s, and escape kind of Thatcher politics and the Cold War in Europe to sail across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And we spent 8 years living on the boat before we kind of finally settled down in New Zealand. So those were my earliest experience.
So there's a whole bunch of water sports you can take up. There's swimming, there's water skiing, there's a whole variety of things that people are very familiar with on the water. Free diving is very unique. Um, who first introduced it to you, and what led you to love it?
Yeah, when you think of all those sports, like the ones you mentioned, water skiing, right? It's you're not actually in the water. You're if you're in the water, that's because you've fallen off. You haven't done it right. And even in
Hmm.
swimming, we call that an aquatic sport, but you're on that boundary between the water and the air, and you're taking advantage of the fact that the body moves faster through air. So bringing your arms out of the water in order to recover them in each stroke. So there's no actual sport that's fully aquatic, immersed in the water, other than freediving. Freediving is the only purely aquatic sport. That's part of the attraction for me. Being underwater, like completely immersed in the aquatic world on his own terms without any assistance, any help of any kind.
And as a child, you were experimenting with it because you then end up going to an academy in Italy, right? To train.
Yeah, that's when I kind of got on my radar the idea that this was actually a sport and you could train and set records and compete. So it's like I've got to give this a go, and spent a few months in the Caribbean, just diving every day from the scuba boats, and then from there went to Italy to train under Umberto Perazzari, who at the time was in the 90s was the top freediver in the world, setting all the world records. He had retired at that point, but he was still kind of like the maestro to learn from.
And when we talk about free diving, there's various events, right? There's the one that we were really focused on in the documentary, where there's a rope basically that you're following down. But are there also types of free dives that don't involve following a rope, or is that always there as sort of a safety thing for you?
Yeah, for the depth disciplines, it's always there because if you're not following a rope, you could go AWOL, you could go off to the side, come up in a different spot. It would be impossible to provide safety. And also, that rope is a means of bringing the athlete back to the surface if something happens. So we're kind of tethered to that line with running carabiner. And you can see from the surface what the diver is doing via like a sonar or via, we have an underwater drone now that we use in competitions. So you can actually see them on the camera there. And if something happens, if they stop moving, stop coming up, then you can pull that whole rope that they're diving next to, you can pull that up, and the plate at the bottom of it will catch their carabiner and pull them to the surface as well. So it's like a last ditch, last resort way of bringing them to the surface that we very, very rarely have to use, but it is there for those kind of eventualities.
Just to give people perspective, you broke the world record in 2016 in the vertical blue competition in the Bahamas, going 124 meters deep, 407 feet. To give people perspective, two Big Bens in England, or half an Eiffel Tower, the MetLife building here in New York. You hold your breath for more than 4 minutes. I'd love for you to kind of take us through that process. For those of us who, might swim recreationally, you go underwater, you hold your breath for a few seconds, you see how far you can go. This is next level. And the way you describe it in the documentary, you're talking about at some moment your brain turns itself off. When you're underwater, when you're taking one of these dives for 4+ minutes, take us through those 4 minutes, how you're approaching it physically and how you approach it mentally.
Sure, yeah, it takes me sometimes longer to explain it than to actually just do the dive. But the dive actually starts before you take that last breath, because it's really important to get into a completely relaxed and zoned out state before the dive, to slow your system, your heart rate down, so that it's consuming less oxygen. So in those last few minutes before the dive, that's kind of a critical phase where we're trying to set ourselves up for the right kind of precondition. And then we take obviously as big a breath as possible. We use a technique called packing to push more air into the lungs after that breath, using your mouth like a pump to push the air in. And then start to go down in this discipline. This is the free immersion discipline, so we're allowed to use the rope to pull ourselves down and back up. But on the way down, your lungs are compressing due to the pressure of the water column above you. So your lungs lose volume, and thus your body actually loses buoyancy due to the loss of that volume in the lungs. So at a certain point, you can go into what we call the free fall, where your body is heavier than the water around it, and so you don't need to swim anymore. You don't need to pull yourself down, and you can just stop and sink. And it's, at first, it can be kind of a little bit of a disconcerting experience, because you start falling faster and faster as you lose more and more buoyancy. But after a while, you can start to kind of enjoy that experience and see it as the ocean kind of welcoming you and embracing you. And in that phase, again, it's very important to be completely relaxed and to focus on equalization. Equalization becomes more difficult the deeper you go. Equalization is where you have to bring air into your ears to compensate for the loss of volume there. So that inner ear space, the middle ear space, is a trapped air volume. If you don't equalize it, then the pressure outside gets too big and the eardrums rupture. So we have to keep on pushing air into the middle ear to equalize it. And that is fine close to the surface, but as you get very deep and your lungs are completely squashed, where do you get that air from? It becomes a pretty difficult process. So that's kind of the focus on the way down. Then when we turn at the bottom, grab the tag, which is the proof that you've been to that depth, and then start to come back up to the surface. And here you pay for the free ride that you got on the way down. So that buoyancy, the heaviness that took you to the depth, is now working against you on the way up, and you've got to work hard to get back to the surface. So there's no free ride on the way up. It's like a slog all the way back up to the surface. I'd say probably about 70 or 80% of the actual work of the dive is done on the ascent. And this is where you're running out of oxygen, your levels of carbon dioxide and lactic acid are getting super high. You're narked due to the narcotic effects of gases under pressure. But yes, as you mentioned before, during all of this, you have to kind of stay completely serene internally in your mind and not kind of allow yourself to get panicky or anything like that, which would then consume more oxygen. So it's about kind of like managing all of these features, and there's more that I haven't mentioned, while staying kind of inwardly very calm.
Yeah, you're going 400 feet down. You're. By the way, that 4 minutes and 34 seconds, is that the longest that you've held your breath underwater, William, or have you gone further than that?
No, it's not, because you imagine that's me moving the most of the time. So I'm using my muscles and they're consuming oxygen. If I stay still and just float in the pool face down, then the longest I've held my breath is 8 minutes.
Remarkable. The way you describe the journey down, all the various things that are going through your mind, are you also keeping time? Like, do you know, like, ooh, I'm going slower than I need to be. Like, I'm not going to be able to hit my target. To what extent are you counting, or do you, at this point, given all the years you've done this, do you have kind of an innate clock without having to count second by second?
Yeah, it's completely innate. So there's been so many dives, so many repetitions, not just the deep ones, but shallower ones where you're working on technique. So everything has been programmed into the subconscious mind. And that's critical for the success of the dive, because if you're having to think and make decisions while you're underwater, not only will you consume more oxygen, but those decisions are less likely to be accurate compared to when you just allow this autopilot to take over. So, yeah, as much as possible, you want to kind of just get out of the way and let your body do the dive for itself.
There's obviously a lot of rigorous physical training that you have to go through to be able to do this. If you had to split it up, though, like how much of this is physical, how much of this is mental in terms of succeeding at the sport? Is
I
there a
get asked.
percentage split?
Yep, I get asked the question a lot, and the only answer I can give is it's 100% mental and 100% physical, because, and you can call that 50-50 if you want, but you have to be firing on both departments completely. You cannot muscle yourself down to 400 feet and back up, and nor can you meditate down and float down to that depth. And so that's part of what's appealing to me about the sport, right? Because it's a completely physical and a completely mental challenge. And in the past sports that I played, they were mostly physical. Like I rowed at university for a while. It's a very kind of brute force discipline. And then before that, I played chess competitively for a while, and that's just purely mental. And so in both cases, I wasn't satiated. Like I felt like I either had like a lot of kind of nervous physical energy, or I was just kind of like my mind was wandering because it wasn't given anything to do. In freediving, you are completely like engaged physically and mentally. Even if your mind is turned off, that's part of this kind of process of mental control that you are having to engage in. So yeah, it's all mental, all physical.
When you use the phrase "mind is turned off," or in the documentary you said like your brain turns itself off, and then you have 1 to 2 minutes before brain damage. Explain what that
Those are
means. Hey,
two different things. So one is when I'm talking about like shutting down the mind, I'm talking about like just concentrating on the spaces between thoughts. So your rational mind, the kind of the stream of consciousness, the dialogue that's always going, that is for a certain period of time just mostly turned off. You can't completely. There's always going to be those little thoughts that just bump into you, but you can stretch out those spaces between those until that's kind of the majority of it. In the documentary, if I talked about the mind being turned off in a blackout, that's when your brain has kind of analyzed the gases and made a decision. Okay, oxygen is getting too low. We're going to shut down the brain function, and so you black out. And if that happens when you're underwater, then you stop moving. Your safety diver grabs you and brings you to the surface. If you're by yourself, then you die 100% of the time. But if your safety diver is there and you're kind of 5-10 meters from the surface on the way back up, then it's pretty benign because they can just grab you, bring you to the surface. And as soon as you come back to the surface and they take off your mask, your body senses that you're in the air again. You have like nerve cells on your face. And so you wake up and you start breathing again. And within a few seconds, you're normal and laughing, and there's no damage or anything at all. So that's a shallow water blackout due to the level of oxygen becoming too low during the free dive.
Yeah, and there's a lot of risks associated with this. I mean, obviously, one of the places that you have dove is the Blue Hole off of the Sinai Peninsula.
Hmm.
And that's featured in the documentary. It's called you refer to it as the most dangerous spot on Earth. It's taken more than 100 lives, more dangerous than Mount Everest. Tell me about that location. What makes it so dangerous? And then what's the appeal?
It's an amazing, beautiful location. It's a blue hole in the reef, but with this archway that connects that blue hole to the open ocean on the other side of the reef. And the archway starts at 55 meters and extends very far below that. So the bottom of the arch is 90 or more meters. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Not so much to freedivers because, well, I mean, freedivers who try to go through, then it's dangerous, sure. But most of us, most of the time, we're not going through the arch. Whereas scuba divers, it's kind of this celebrated kind of rite of passage in the area that you've got to go through the arch, and it's at a depth where it starts to get into you start to run into problems with narcosis. And there's no kind of like safety net. If you do have a problem and you start to go deeper, then the problem is exacerbated, and the there's no stopping you before you get to the bottom below at like 90, 100 meters. And so for scuba divers, it's very treacherous. In freediving, yeah, there's been a few people who have gone through the arch. I was one of the first to do it with no fins and no suit back in 2007, but I haven't had a chance to visit it again since then.
And as far as locations around the world, how many places are kind of considered the go-to places for free divers? Are there numerous locations, or are there sort of a handful of locations that are frequented?
Yeah, well, technically, you can freedive anywhere where there's water, and that's 70% of the planet. But when you
Right.
actually look at places that are conducive to good freediving, you kind of get a little bit fussy because it's better if it's warm, right? And if there's strong currents, it makes line diving, like diving vertically, very, very difficult. The same if there's like big waves on the surface, or if there's problems with boat traffic, jellyfish in some areas. And so it whittles it down to just a few places where you can get kind of calmish conditions with semi-warm water. And there's a few locations that really stand out. The Blue Hole in Dahab is one of them, but these days it's super, super crowded and it's quite a tight space. The Blue Hole where we run Vertical Blue, which was also in the documentary, that's in the Bahamas, Dean's Blue Hole. That's larger and it's kind of in the corner of a lagoon. It's always warm. So that's probably the best place in the world for freediving. And it's certainly the place where most of the world records of the last kind of 15, 20 years have been set.
All right, so William, you were saying a few thousand now compete globally, but when we're talking about people who can dive to the depths of, let's say, 100 meters or more, how many people have been able to achieve that?
So 100 meters, 330 feet, I want to say like maybe 40 athletes have been that deep or more, 40 or 50,
So,
somewhere around.
so you're one of the 40 people in human history who've been able to dive that deep.
Yeah.
Tell me, you're talking about the control you're able to have physically and mentally over yourself below the water. How do those lessons, what you've learned through the sport, manifest themselves above ground as part of daily activities, family life? You're the father of two kids, etc. Are there lessons that you've learned underwater, the skills you've developed that translate to day-to-day activities or other things, hobbies, etc., that you're interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. And actually, an area that I've been moving into recently is trying to apply these techniques, these kind of gifts that the ocean has given us to day-to-day life. I see freediving as this kind of test tube experiment in extreme stress or anxiety management. Like if you think of, you're floating there in the water, you're taking this last breath, and that's got to kind of sustain you for the next 4 minutes while you're going, yeah, like 30 floors down underwater. And the knowledge that if you do if you are stressed or anxious, or if you do start to get panicky, that is going to make the most likely outcome a blackout underwater. So that kind of feeds back into this stress or anxiety loop. So being able to manage that is this kind of test tube experiment in the techniques that you need to be in complete control of your mind at all times, your mind and emotions. And those techniques apply just as well to the kind of stresses or anxieties that we experience in our regular life, whether it's at work or at home. And so, yeah, I've seen that these techniques have such a huge application, and so recently created the system that's called the mental immune system that basically packages all of these techniques. And the most important thing is that it has to become something that's subconscious, because if you have a technique that you have to remember to use, like, okay, now I'm stressed out, I've got to do this breathing method, I've got to focus on this, then you're never going to remember to do that in the heat of the moment, or it's not going to be, you can't concentrate on that and on what you need to concentrate on during that argument with your wife or board meeting or public speaking, whatever it is. So it has to be something that's in the background, that's subconscious. And so the idea of the mental immune system is that these techniques can be programmed into your subconscious, so they operate in the background and keep you kind of totally inwardly serene and calm, and allow you to concentrate and perform doing what you're doing.
Yeah, I feel like in today's world, in today's society, with all the stresses going on, etc., there's quite an appetite for that, William. You know, the lessons you've learned to be able to control, in a world where we feel we have less and less control over the things that are going on, right? And everything feels chaotic and everything's connected, and a stress on the other side of the other side of the planet feels like, stressful to you. That there's an opportunity here to teach some of what you're doing, or some of what you've learned underwater, to the rest of us who live most of our lives above ground.
Absolutely, yeah. If you look at the numbers, it's really disturbing. Like 70% of people are reporting stress in the workplace. 30% of adults have stress or anxiety disorders. That's not just like, I'm feeling kind of stressed some of the time. It's an actual clinical disorder, and most of those are taking medications for it, which then come packaged with all sorts of other problems. So, yeah, being able to deal with your stress or anxiety yourself in a way that doesn't create other dependencies is so important for this day and age, for sure.
What sorts of as you were prepping yourself mentally to continue to dive to deeper depths, are you doing yoga? What types of things are you doing to kind of get your mind in the right place? Are you reading certain philosophers? Are you listening to certain types of music? Curious, what you found that help you get to the right mind space.
Yeah, a mix of all of the above, I guess. Definitely music. Like, use music in the kind of preparation on the day to find that space. But the techniques of meditation are very similar to the techniques that we just use in our regular training for freediving. Because if we're if we're doing a really hard training session where we have to hold our breath with, say, for example, empty lungs, and then you get one breath and you've got to do it again, do that 10 times, then you're constantly in this space of having a really strong urge to breathe, and you never escape that. So you have to be able to cope with that mentally, and using techniques that cultivate kind of equanimity, or seeing the sensations as just data information that's coming to your awareness. So being detached from this urge to breathe or pain, or whatever you want to call it. All of those techniques are very similar to techniques that are taught or used in meditation as well.
When you speak to people, and I think part of the documentary is also educating many of us who are very unfamiliar with the sport about what you do. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that you hear that you feel like you have to correct, or the things that surprise people the most when you tell them about the sport?
Yeah, the biggest misconception is just this one, that we kind of have this death wish that it's like this super dangerous sport. And it is, if you just go out and do it by yourself. Even if you just go into your swimming pool and try to do a breath hold by yourself, that's almost suicidal, because if you do black out, no one's watching you, you die. But if you're there with someone who knows the safety techniques and the safety protocols, then it's completely safe and benign exercise. So it is something that's at the reach of everyone. And you don't need to be any particular size or shape or age or anything in order to freedive. We have, I teach kids, I teach people who are 60s, 70s. So there's no real barrier to freediving. And probably the other big misconception is that most people think they can only hold their breath for 30 seconds or a minute. Almost everybody can do well beyond that. Someone who's in kind of like fairly healthy, good shape can normally hold their breath at least kind of 2 or 3 minutes on the first course that they take. So we have this potential, this innate ability that almost always exceeds preconceptions about what we can do underwater on a breath hold.
Wait, now I want to get in a swimming pool right now. What's holding me back? What is the thing that you tell people that take them, like I think I'm a 30-second person. What are the things that I don't know about myself or the basic techniques? I mean, obviously you go through a whole training regimen, but just curious, kind of, are there a couple things top of mind that you immediately tell people and it totally changes the dynamic for how long they can hold their breath underwater?
Yeah, there's many. I'll give you two just off the bat. One is relaxation is critical before, as I talked about before, the breath hold. So like you want to just like completely relax for a good couple of minutes at least before you hold your breath. And then the other one is that when you start holding your breath, the first period, you might not feel anything, like no urge to breathe. You just kind of feel nice and relaxed. Maybe you'll feel like a bursting sensation in your lungs, like just from having like this full breath, but that's it. But then after a while, you'll start to get that urge to breathe, right? You'll start to get this kind of desire to take a breath, and you think that's because you're running out of air. And when we say running out of air, we mean running out of oxygen. But that's not the case. Your oxygen levels at that point, if we put a pulse oximeter on you, they would still measure like close to 100% saturation, like you have bulk oxygen. What's happening is the level of carbon dioxide is building in your body. Carbon dioxide is the waste gas, which gives us the trigger to breathe again. So if you just tell yourself, I'm not running out of air, no matter what it feels like, it is the level of carbon dioxide that's building. Later, much further down the track, if you get experiences of freediving, you might be able to take it to levels where your oxygen is dropping kind of to its limit as well. But to begin with, it's all carbon dioxide, provided you don't hyperventilate. So definitely don't kind of like over breathe before you hold your breath. Yeah, that urge to breathe, that sensation is just going to be CO2. So just tell yourself, okay, that's nice. That's information about this gas, CO2 in my body. But I can stay relaxed. I can hold my breath longer.
So you're having this internal conversation with yourself as you're going through these processes.
Yeah, it's all about these inner dialogues, often in freediving, or trying to shut them off.
Fascinating what is possible with mind over body, Will. Appreciate you taking time to talk about the sport. Anything that we should be on the lookout for people looking to learn more about freediving, kind of post the Netflix documentary? What are places they can turn to? Where can they watch competitions? Where can they learn more about the sport?
Sure, yeah. I'd recommend just trying to kind of get involved in a local club or group, or if there's a local instructor who can take you through a beginner's course. You don't need to be living close to the sea to be able to do a course. You can do a introduction to freediving in a swimming pool where you're taught how to hold your breath, how to swim laps underwater. So yeah, if you're interested, definitely give that a try, because it is, as I said before, a lot easier than most people think, and it's a lot more rewarding than people think as well.
We were talking before the podcast. You're the father of 2 young children. How deep have they gotten so far? I know they're very young. Do they have ambitions to follow in their father's footsteps?
We'll see. I'm not pushing them in either direction, but they both love the water. They're both born in the water. And my oldest, who's 4, she's kept up with her age in terms of meters, so she can kind of swim down as like a little frog to 4 meters and grab something and bring it back up.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to talk through everything with us, and good luck. I know the next big competition. You're the co-founder of the Vertical Blue competition in the
Mhm.
Bahamas is coming up next summer.
Yeah, next July. I'll maybe have an event before that. We'll see.
All right. Thank you.
Have a good day.